So our next speaker is Adler Yang, and he is committed to addressing the systemic problems he's committed to addressing systemic problems since adolescence. He founded the Awakening Corporation Lab, a think and do tank focused on researching and designing for more regenerative and harmonious societies with compassion and critical complex systems awareness. The lab has supported marginalized youth and directed the R&D for ZA Share, Taiwan's largest educational experimentation and innovative platform. He has also been involved with various governmental and civic organizations internationally, such as the National Development Council in Taiwan and Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Germany. His documentary film, If There Is a Reason to Study, it came out in 2016, won international recognition and influenced education movements in Taiwan. Very impressive. And his talk is entitled Discovering Allocation Dependence and the Persistence of Diplomaism in Taiwan, an attempt to uncover common mechanisms underlying wicked problems. And let's read him.
Thank you. So I'm the guy who asked complicated questions, as Dr. Porpora just mentioned. Although my questions sound pretty philosophical, but my concern actually are very rooted in practical concerns. And I feel that the beauty of CR is that it reconciles the practical and the theoretical very well. So in the past 14 years, I've been mainly involved in education reform and social innovation, and I still do related work for a living. However, through practice, I soon realized that the predominant positivistic, reductionistic, mechanistic, and anthropocentric ways of grappling with problems, even in the realm of social change, greatly limits our work in a sense that we mostly seek to fix symptoms at the surface level. So the same problems continue to perpetuate with the disguise of different appearances. So with that realization, I gradually put more and more effort into studying the underlying common mechanisms of such wicked problems and testing my findings through practice. I'm not sure if it's fortunate or not. I had to do most of such research independently because it has been extremely difficult to fit it in any academic programs I have access so far. So today I'm here to seek for advice. My independent research has been mainly guided by the philosophy underlying complex system theory, and I eventually found my work highly compatible with, and probably more communicable with, critical realism. Since I want to show you that my theoretical insights indeed come from empirical data, I'll briefly touch upon the rationale and the immediate findings behind my major study design, but I'll then zoom out to give a greater picture. And I understand that discussion will not be enough, so I'd be especially appreciate that if you can give more strategic advice on what might be the best way to improve the rigor of my study, what might be the best ways to dissect my large piece of work into academic rigorous publications, and hopefully also get a degree so I can navigate in academia more smoothly. So since I was a child, I have been committed to understanding or uncovering the underlying common mechanisms of what is called wicked problems. The word common, I think, is important here, is because even with my childish common sense, I realized that if the workings of the world isn't segregated by disciplinary boundaries, how in the world would causes behind problems bounded by disciplines? So with that early intervention, I embraced a position that is shared by both complex systems and critical realism, which is the idea of open systems, stratified, emergentist view of causality. So among the vast options, I chose education as a field to start with. One is because that it was most accessible to me as a teenager. But also the other is because that education, in a broad sense, is the process of forming people's modes of relationship. Because so, I believe that the formation of generative mechanisms can be easier observed and identified through the process of education. Now looking back, I find my rationale quite compatible with Archer's morphogenic approach. I chose the diplomaism as a wicked problem, and it is sometimes translated as other definitions, which is also coincidentally related to Rosa's credentialism research just by now. The way it is wicked, we can see it in those pictures. So on the upper right, you see that roughly until 30 years ago, people still do whatever they can to get great marks in entrance exams. But years later, the admission processes happen reform and reform with the intent, such as to allow more holistic development of the children and prevent cramming or teaching to the test. However, with the focus isn't on while the focus isn't on test content that much anymore, people still do lots sorts of extreme things. For example, as you can see in the right bottom, is that people line up all night just for the limited spots of volunteering at the hospital so they can make their student portfolio look better in admissions. So my research question here is, why does diplomaism persist despite decades of reforms? And what are the underlying mechanisms that make diplomaism a common cause of sufferings and social harms as considered by the society? So two widely accepted hypotheses to my questions are, first, the cause is ideological, driven by an imperial version. I think the imperial is emphasis is important here, of Confucianism that is common among East Asians. The other is that the scarcity of good higher education, its economic returns drive competition. So I conducted a natural experiment, which is to basically document an alternative school where teachers, parents, and students consciously opt out from the problematic ideology and practices during a time that higher education is no longer scarce, nor is its economic returns deemed good. The way I collected my data is mainly through video ethnography, which turns out to be the documentary that Professor Porpora just mentioned, and interviews that trace alternative school students from their elementary school to university graduation. Their family, socio-economic background, and education backgrounds were also taken into consideration. So the initial service level findings is that if this were a positive research, I would probably conclude by saying that learner-centered or self-directed learning is superior to traditional pedagogy in many ways, and it actually confirms plenty of existing literature. However, I have deeper concerns. From the qualitative observations, I see that they convince themselves that their passions, their potentials, their other learnings aren't as important as test requirements. They voluntarily, because the school doesn't require so, and their parents didn't push them so, they voluntarily uh, opt in for the entrance exams while having other options and sacrifice their sparks, being the and become the persons that they previously disagreed and even deemed detrimental. So, because of the time, I'll use only one student's story to illustrate. He's actually my very good childhood friend. To me, he was like Da Vinci. You can see here that he was able to do unicycle very good, job jazz impromptu, and he even self-taught himself 3D animation before Wikipedia was a thing, and always share his theoretical musings about things such as these using the blocks on the upper right to represent different theories of the structures of universe. So originally, he didn't take entrance exams seriously. He said plenty thoughtful ideas, like he described that excelling in tests is like drinking Diet Coke. It makes you full, but the nutrition is actually empty. But later, he became convinced that in order to get good education that can really help him fulfill his potentials, he began to give up doing all the things that he was passionate about and only just focus on the subjects relevant to the tests. Even in the process, he occasionally questioned, why does he have to give up all of those things that matter? He still bit the bullet to move on and eventually find satisfaction in test taking. Unfortunately, his learning at the alternative school made him made him through to a selective traditional high school. The test-based traditional high school pedagogy didn't help him to get into the major he wanted. He ended up in a program which he didn't really have any interest and potential in. And when he finally decided to take a transfer exam to a program that better suits him, his family went into a financial crisis that required him to contribute to his family's finances. Had he continued to working on 3D animation and other of his passions or potentials, he probably would have already have 8 years of experience when he turned 18 and would have been able to make decent money with such profession or expertise. However, since he stopped doing all that for many years, he didn't have the employable skills. So he had to join, he decided voluntary to alleviate his family's burdens to join the military and become a professional soldier. So, retroducing from my first major study with stories like what I just shared, I discovered a generative mechanism I call allocation dependence. So the structure of allocation dependence, I would say, this mechanism emerges when an agent perceives, whether true or not, that he or she is dependent upon some allocated resource and makes the effort to fit into the allocation measures to redeem allocated resources. This has few immediate features. One is assimilation trimming, uh, meaning that the agent absorbs, acquires previously absent qualities required by the allocation measures, and trimming, the process of getting rid of unfit qualities. Monetization. In this process, people become agnostic of the inherent values of the assimilated and trimmed off qualities. Also, whether they like it or not, how well they fit into the allocation measures also function like how much money you have, in a sense that it determines how many resources or how good the quality of the resource are redeemable or exchangeable. Also the unequalization of differentness. That if we understand that no agents are identical, the affinity and also the affinity between allocation measures and the each agent's qualities differ, we can see that some agents have an edge over others when fitting into the measures. Also, the detachment from resource circulation or regeneration, in a sense that the agent's concerns are shifted towards the resource allocation redemption process, and the concern of circulation or regeneration of resources becomes unnecessary. To explore the causal powers of allocation dependence, I found one is that it has the is causally efficacious in the sense that it can lead to control and fetishism. Control in the sense that it occurs when when the agent is formed through the assimilation trimming processes and the resources allocated, which is um, resources allowing or enabling them to becoming some sort of forms, and also fetishism as a some kind of control over the agent's mind and behavior. And in health, we know that any kind of excess or deficiency, for example, like ingredients or activities, can lead to deterioration of health. And I see alienation as a social version of health deterioration. And assimilation, trimming, the misallocation of resources, and the monetization or negligence of intrinsic values can all lead to this. And waste and pollution. So in ecology, there's a saying that in nature, there's no such thing as waste. Everything must go somewhere. If it doesn't go to somewhere that it should go, it becomes pollution. So we can see that the trimmed off qualities of these agents can be considered as waste. And also, if we look at a more macro scale, for example, like the talents who didn't fit into the job market or who got dropped out of schools, can become some potential risks to themselves and to the society. Inequality in the sense that agents with certain qualities are easier to fit in the measures, while others are disadvantaged. And even the resources of all agents that they possess at T0 are equal. Their fitness against, I mean, the fitness when measured by the allocation measures will also eventually widen the gap. Also, the exhaustion of resources. So unless all resources are fully circulated, regenerated by someone else or some other system, we can expect that the resources will only continue to exhaust as agents' behaviors and the requirements in their behaviors are bounded within the allocation redemption process. In other words, the regeneration process or recirculation process is externalized. Fragility. Through network theory, we know that the greater the size, the sophistication and dependency, and also the lesser the redundancy, diversity, and alternatives, the greater the fragility of a system is. And I found that the allocation dependent structure is fragile because any malfunction in the part of that system can lead to the dysfunction of the whole structure. For example, my friend's unfulfilled promise by the so-called system. And I think allocation dependence is critical realist another way that it is transfactual in a sense that we see it across disciplines. In education, as many of you might be familiar, that throughout different ages, there are different kind of allocated resources. For example, in ancient China, there was the Chinese imperial exam that you fit in by reciting formalized literature, imperial classics to get the bureaucracy posts. And the trim off quality might be, for example, the diversity of thoughts. And in different contexts, for example, like decades ago, it might be nationalism, route learning, and nowadays under a neoliberal regime, the measures might be trainability, job readiness, or STEM, and we see the marginalization of social science and humanities as also a trim off quality in the academia. Also, this is visible in international relationships in a sense that the so-called underdeveloped, undeveloped countries, they depend on the allocated resources from the developed countries, and they have to fit in all sorts of measures. And for example, the indigenous worldviews, ways of living are trimmed off as a consequence. And we can also see similar structure in human domination over animals in the sense that when animals are dependent on human provided food, shelter, or protection, they have to fit in the human criteria of tameness or other quality of being domestic animals, and the ability to live in the wild become trimmed off, or at a species level that those that didn't fit in become extinct. So my finding is that as long as we're allocation dependent, we can expect that the entailed causal powers to be continuously triggered, also not always, leading to the continuous emergence of wicked problems. And I see the emancipatory potential of this theory. You can see as from a map of leverage points here. And also it can help us evaluate existing solutions. For example, we can see circular economy here that it's addressing resource exhaustion. However, we also see its limitations as it's not addressing the assimilation and trimming at a deeper level. And with such a map, we can formulate new solutions based on the evaluations. So there are so many issues to be addressed. So for example, what are the potential practices that might help tackle allocation dependence? What are some of the other common underlying mechanisms? What are the mechanisms enabling and sustaining these conditions? And I'm unable to unfold these details, but as you can see, I have been developing these for years and touch upon them in, for example, like government or think tank reports, book chapters, and so on, and talks. I think also importantly, on the upper right, the praxis, I've also been testing them directly through practice. So to wrap up, um, you can see that not only allocation dependence itself is a enormous project, I also have all these related things to develop. So I have an embodied feeling of finitude of life. And I hope that I can plan and act strategically so I don't die with too many regrets. So to be strategic on carrying on the work I presented above, I think I would love to have all of your advice, and thank you very much.
Yeah, Adler, thank you for that. Um, I think it's very impressive what you're doing. I think it definitely, uh, what's impressive about it is You have a very rich, well, the problem is important. Um, One thing to do if you want to convert this into like a academic article is a good literature review. There's already literature I know in the United States about attacking whole meritocracy
Yeah.
and exams kind of culture. One thing you don't make clear is whether this need to allocate is actually realistic or not. It may be that that is a realistic structural factor. So I think you have to do that, attend to that. But I think the other thing is, it's a very rich ethnography you have, and the development of all these kinds. You've really kind of described richly an important mechanism that's at work here. You need to connect it more. If you want to connect it more to critical realism, then you have to show what the connections are. And I think they're there. You don't, maybe because of time, you didn't make them, but in any written piece, you would need to do that. And you might want to organize the mechanisms that work in terms of whether they're agent-centered people. I mean, you make it sound like they cave in when, again, so agent-centered mechanisms versus externalities that have causal powers. I mean, it may be that this is something that is a realistic, it's tragic but realistic choice that just overwhelms the attempt to go out, to go a different way. But I think it's very interesting what you have there, and I think you can, in fact, um, I have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to stop.
So thank you. My name is Rina. I'm studying education, so this resonated very strongly. I just had reservations about the term like allocation dependence. If you're referring to the students or the those who are chasing after diplomas, like I think it's also the same in the Philippines. We have this they call it diploma mills. So colleges just churning diplomas. Um, and I have reservations about the term because then it seems as if the students are, depending on these resources, which doesn't sit well with me because, um, if you look also at the history of education, it's a long process of like, industrializing it, making it another form of the factory line. And so I think it's beyond this dependence of the students on the system, but in one way you're also forced into that system. So maybe also rethink how you would, or I'm not sure if I understood it correctly, but also rethink how that emerges given also the context of education, or the history of education. So that's one. And the second, I'm also glad you mentioned you cited Meadows, and I think it might be interesting to also look at it. I like seeing the parallels, and I'm not into critical realism, but I saw so many parallels in systems thinking, in seeing how the personal, the political, and even the practical, and then and how it relates to structure, agency, and culture. And I think those are the three mechanisms you have to look at because even if you want to break out of the system of these diploma mills or diplomaism, if you need a diploma, and this is very funny in the Filipino meme, you needed the diploma to be a dishwasher, so if you need a diploma simply to wash dishes, then you're forced. You're not really dependent, but you're forced. So I think that's something you can also explore. And perhaps lastly, this idea of this imperial mode of living. You talked about allocation dependence and you saw you had three different columns, and when you talk about wicked problems, they base it a lot on this very imperialistic mode of living where we have to exploit, which is very capitalistic. We talked about Marx earlier. And I saw in those three columns in education, and I think the second column was
International relations,
international relations, and then the human nature.
dominant.
Exactly, it's the same. So I'm not really sure if it's allocation dependence or that. So Maybe these are things you have to explore further. But yeah, at the beginning, when you look at the research, there's so many ideas, but then it's really to distill to few. Yeah. So I don't know. It wasn't really a question, but yeah, I think it just really sparked a lot of things. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'm fully aware of what you mentioned, like the historical context, and I think that's how the natural experiment part of this research is important because nowadays, getting to college, having a college degree in Taiwan is that makes you disadvantaged in getting a job. And there are a lot of things that we can have a conversation further, but I think that natural experiment shows that in Taiwan, even without those forces, this still happens. And why does that happen? And also, to be completely honest, the work of this is very informed or inspired by complex adaptive systems. So in that sense, I think the dependence, of course, I can continue to figure out and think about what you said, but from a complex adaptive system perspective, what are the rules that the agents follow and that lead to the emergence of complex behaviors? I think that dependence, whether it's externally enforced or intrinsically driven, I think that's the case I found. Yeah.
Let me just say that trying to connect all this to both critical realism and complex adaptive systems, it's possible there's too much going on for one paper. You should look to different journals. You could do one in a complexity journal and one in more maybe critical realist oriented one, or it doesn't have to be necessarily critical realist, but it's a little bit too much going on, I think.
Hmm.
Other online? Well, yeah, okay, because I'm not seeing it. All right, for a person online, it's not coming up. So, do you want to ask your question?
Is that me you're asking, or?
It sounds like it.
Oh, sorry, sorry, I didn't.
I don't know who it is. So,
Okay, I'm Karen. I'm connected from Germany, so I'm in broadly in the field of education, and I'm really pleased to have listened to your presentation. I thought it was fantastic. It was really good and really inspiring. I have to say, I read your title before attending, obviously, but your title wasn't that inspiring. And that's possibly one of the things I want to tell you, that in the title of the presentation, you kind of included all the keywords and conclusions almost, and it wasn't transparent to me what you were going to talk about. But then when you did talk about it, it made all the sense. I'm just saying it might be, you could perhaps create more attractive titles for your presentation by making them less complex.
she has a point.
Yeah.
Probably next time I should consult you before I form the title.
Well, yeah, but I really, really liked your presentation, because that's a phenomenon most of my students struggle with. The testing system and its washback effect on education. I'm just wondering whether the system is actually having a wicked problem. Of course, if you look from the potential of humans, it is a wicked problem that not all their capabilities will be developed and some capabilities will be trimmed, so to say. But from the system's perspective, it might actually work really well, because the goal is that it induces discipline over years of schooling, students are disciplined. Their passions, their educational desires are, you know, they suppress them almost because the system does. So I'm just wondering whether, looking at it from the governmental side of things, but also from the systemic sides, it's actually functioning really well. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Thanks, Karen. I think I also get what you're saying, and I really appreciate your comment. I think one reason that I consider it as a wicked problem is because I have regular meeting with, not regular, but like yearly, like once or twice meeting with the Ministry of Education, and they were like having all these people, including me, and people are these like officials are discussing why even we changed the emission system, why are they still cramming? We don't want that, and so on and so on. So we want them to be more holistic, and we want them to be more creative, and so on. But why is that cramming still there? So of course, the there can be hidden agendas and hidden curriculums, as I think most of the people here would be aware of. But I think when the when the government's intentions, and since I'm also part of like a practitioner involved in the education reform, so even with these so-called good intentions, why does it still turn out to be repeating the same, perpetuating the same existing system? So in that sense, I think that uh, the traditional critical uh, s- like critical pedagogy literature, in some sense, especially the Marxist idea of like hidden curriculums, hidden agendas of the government, still I think it's explanatory in some cases, but maybe not all occasions. And I think that might be a contribution of my work.
Okay, I think we have to stop